NACDL is the association of the nation's criminal defense bar.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. Accidental overdose prosecutions are weapons in the failing war on drugs. These weapons result in overcriminalization and mass incarceration that disproportionately impacts our communities of color. Treating accidental overdose deaths as homicides is another example of choosing to use punitive forces of the criminal justice system rather than treating the root causes of public health, community, and societal factors. These policies are ineffective in reducing drug use, drug overdoses, or deaths, and may actually contribute to exacerbating the problems. Someday, I hope soon, legislatures and prosecutors will stop promoting these terrible policies. Until then, we're here together, 1,500 of us across this country, to help ensure that the criminal defense bar is equipped with the tools they need to effectively and zealously advocate on behalf of the clients. We're here together with NACDL to work on this. This program is part of NACDL's commitment to a more rational and humane criminal legal system. NACDL is an organization that I love, I've been very involved with. Many of you are members. I hope those of you who aren't members will consider joining. It's a wonderful organization where we can get free or very cheap educational materials that can help us win our next case. And also, many of us are by ourselves shouting for justice in our community. Together, our voice is amplified and stronger, and the legislators will one day hear the truths that we have and we experience in our communities. Thank each of you, 1,500 of you across this country, for all the hard work you do on behalf of your clients and your communities every single day. Our first speaker we're thrilled to have is Lisa Newman-Polk. Lisa is an attorney and licensed clinical social worker. She began her legal career in federal court as a federal defender in Montana. Most of us think we would never leave if we were in Montana, but Lisa in fact left and went to be a state court public defender in Massachusetts. It was in Massachusetts that she put her social work degree, or she pursued her social work degree and became a licensed clinical social worker and works daily with clients and people dealing with addiction and mental health issues. Much of her work and her advocacy centers on just these kind of cases. Lisa, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Let me just clarify my time in Montana. I was an intern, law clerk in law school with the Federal Defenders of Montana. And I practiced law as a public defender. And then in midstream in my career, I went back to social work school. And during that time, I worked as an addiction therapist, both doing individual therapy and group therapy. And then I also worked at our maximum security prison in Massachusetts called Sousa Baranowski, where I was a mental health clinician and saw an incredible amount of rampant addiction throughout the prison system that was not being treated. So when I returned to the practice of law with the public defender office, and then ultimately went into private practice doing mostly contract public defender work, I became really focused on the issue of addiction in our criminal justice system. So that has become a great passion of mine. I think one of the reasons that I've been asked to be involved in this presentation or this training is because I had a case called Commonwealth versus Eldred in 2018, in which I, along with my co-counsel Benjamin Keene, argued that it's unconstitutional to order a defendant who suffers from substance use disorder to be drug-free while on probation, and then impose criminal sanctions for drug use when substance use continues despite negative consequences. That's the very definition of addiction. So very unfortunately and depressingly for me, we did not win this case, but I feel very strongly, I think very strongly that the arguments that we made are really legally correct And a lot of what we argued in that case, I think, is very important in all sorts of criminal defense work, from mitigation, sentencing arguments, and also in cases such as these, where there are often people who are addicted being charged with, quote, distributing to another individual. So my focus today is the discussion of really what substance use disorder is and how our knowledge of addiction can help us as advocates with our clients. So first and foremost, language. As the screen says, language is important. And I think all of us know this as advocates, that how we phrase things in court and on paper really makes a difference. And when it comes to addiction, there's actually some research evidence about this. So often when I give talks, I say, if you don't take away anything else from the presentation, just take away this slide, which is screenshot it, save it, spread it around to your office, your colleagues, everybody, but really change the language of addiction that you are using. So for example, we do not want to use the term substance abuse. And when you think about it, it starts to make sense. It didn't dawn on me until someone brought it to my attention. But what do we think about when we think of abuse? We think of violence, we think of sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, child abuse. In short, we think of criminal behavior. And the movement, I hope that we are all a part of, is trying to treat drug use and addiction as not criminal behavior, but in fact, a mental health issue that we need to be dealing with through other avenues than the criminal legal system. So the reason this term substance abuse has become so common is because that is actually what the clinical term used to be. So the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, which I will talk about further in a moment, this is the Bible of mental disorders. And in the DSM-4, the fourth edition, they had diagnoses of substance abuse and substance dependence. And I believe, or I've been told, that in part because of research that was done on how this term abuse was impacting people suffering from addiction, the term was ultimately changed, and the illness itself was slightly restructured in terms of the diagnosis and diagnostic criteria in the DSM-5, and it was changed to substance use disorder. This change happened in 2013. So you may have noticed that you now hear this term substance use disorder, but often substance abuse is still used. And the worst is when somebody writes substance abuse disorder. That makes me crazy. It's like a conflating of the disorders, and the real effort in the DSM-5 was to get off the abuse word. So the reason I raise this for us as advocates is because there was research done by Dr. John Kelly, a psychologist at Mass General Hospital and out of Harvard. And he did research that showed that even clinicians with a high-level degree and experience in treating people, that when the term substance abuse is used, or substance abuser, even a clinician with experience working with people is more likely to think that their patient requires some sort of punitive sanction, or is morally culpable for their addiction than when the term substance use or substance use disorder was used. So the way he did this research was to provide a vignette, and the vignette was exactly the same, but in one, the person was called a substance abuser, and in the other, the person had a substance use disorder. And so the outcomes were clear that using the language use and use disorder led to the listener or the reader of the vignette to actually not conclude that the person was morally culpable or that that person should be punitively sanctioned. So for us as advocates in the court system, it's really important to use that subtle, and maybe not so subtle use of words to influence the judge and even the prosecutor. So along those lines, if we go down the list, clean versus dirty, pass versus failed. So this is having to do with drug testing. All of us who have clients, on probation or in parole, and they have to take drug tests because we haven't moved far enough away from that as a society. We it's would be good for all of us to start using just the clinical terminology, which is positive versus negative. So in the clinical world, they would say it's a positive toxicology screen. That would be the technical term, or negative toxicology screen. So just it was positive screen, it was a negative screen, because when we put clean and dirty and pass fail, those are obviously really judgmental terms. Drug of choice versus drug of addiction. So choice obviously lends to this idea that addiction is just a choice. And in fact, the whole definition of what an addiction is that it really is no longer of choice. So there will have been a choice in the beginning, perhaps, for a person to try a certain substance. But once somebody is addicted, it's no longer a choice, it's an addiction. So it's trying to get away from using that kind of a phrase. And then finally, the idea of using person-first language. So instead of referring to our clients as an addict, obviously, I don't think anyone's calling their client, except maybe facetiously in the office, a junkie or a drunk. But I do often hear in the courtroom and in court papers that people refer to clients as an addict. So it's really good to get away from this word, just because it's talking about someone as that the addiction is the totality of the person, right? So it's also when we're advocating for clients with other mental health disorders, for example, we don't want to use the terminology, oh, he's a schizophrenic or he's a bipolar. It's a person who has schizophrenia, a person who has bipolar disorder. Similarly, with addiction, it's a person with a substance use disorder, or a person who uses, or a person who is addicted. Granted, it can be a shorthand to use the term addict, but I just would really encourage not to do that. There's a similar movement, as many people are probably aware, around not using the term inmate or even prisoner these days, and instead a person who's incarcerated, or just a person, an individual. Okay, so that's a big slide. Please share it with everybody you know, and try to convince your fellow advocates to change their language. And I will just say, if a client is referring to themselves with terminology that's on my no list, I'm not going to sit and correct somebody who's struggling themselves. That's not appropriate, I don't think, but just for us who are in the advocacy world. So what is an addiction? Also known now in the clinical term as a severe substance use disorder. So I'll get to the criteria for in the DSM-5 for substance use disorder, but addiction is on the severe end of the spectrum. So it's intense cravings and a compulsive use that continues despite negative consequences. So given that that's the definition, it would seem that it doesn't make too much sense that we have a criminal legal system that uses punishment as a way to stop people from using, but that is where we largely still are as a society. So that's a big policy issue, obviously, that we are using punishment and punitive sanctions as the way to deal with something that actually, by definition, continues despite punitive sanctions. So just a global problem we have. And then additionally, a sort of large part of the definition is the physical and mental tolerance that drives a person to use the drug of addiction as if their life depends on it, right? So when somebody doesn't suffer from an addiction, it can be easy, I think, to be judgmental and say, what's wrong with that person? Why don't you just stop your habit, by the way? That's another word I should have put on the no list, because a habit can be like biting your nails or all sorts of things that many of us do in our daily lives. And to compare the sort of mainstream habits, if you will, of life to an addiction is to really understate what an addiction really does to a person's brain and body. So the DSM-5, as I mentioned, now since 2013, defines substance use in terms of substance use disorder. Often we will shorthand it as SUD, which certainly helps if you are writing a brief and needing to refer to this over and over again. It can get really clunky to use substance use disorder. So an SUD or SUD, so on page 483 of the DSM-5, I definitely encourage every law office to have a copy of the DSM-5. Not only because of addiction, but because so many of our clients are suffering from various mental health disorders. And it's just helpful to have a clinical understanding of what the diagnostic criteria is. So I just pulled out from page 483, I think the really overarching sections that I think are the primary parts of substance use disorder. So clearly highlighted here: continuing using a substance despite significant substance-related problems. So this is why I think, again, a person who's not addicted often can have a difficult time relating to, why does somebody keep doing this when they've lost their job, they've lost their spouse, they've gone to prison for years? That is the whole point. That's the mental disorder of it all. So there, is clear research showing that there's a change in brain circuits when a person is addicted. And also it's defined by repeated relapses. So I think we all probably had clients who have done at times, they seem like they're doing well. Maybe the first 90 days is going great, feeling good. Sometimes it's referred to as the pink cloud, when they're feeling like everything is going great. And then something can be triggering. And sometimes the trigger is just absolute boredom, or sort of this just malaise about life in general, and a relapse can happen. And so relapse is often defined as being a normal part of addiction. The only reason some people prefer to stay away from that is because, of course, we don't want to say that someone has to relapse in order to be, repeated relapse is a part of recovery. That is often what is said, is that relapse is a part of recovery. And it is very often, if not most of the time, a part of recovery. But certainly there are people who are fortunate and have a period where they get into treatment and then it just clicks right away. And I think something that's important to point out is that when we're talking about addiction, and that relapse issue and the continuing to use despite negative consequences, it's where you have a person who has really said to themselves, I want to stop using. I cannot live like this. I want to stop using. And despite that mental commitment and this real sincerity, they still find themselves continuing to do it. And so it's something that when I've been in the clinical work or working with clients now, I now work with men serving life sentences who are seeking parole, and some have really struggled with addiction through the years in prison and some haven't. And a lot of times I will ask, the ones who stopped using, often somewhere in their early to mid 20s, when you stopped using the opioid that you've been using daily, how did that happen? And I've had guys say to me, well, I just decided I really wanted to stop. And that's a person who's not really struggling with addiction per se. They've gotten into a pattern of use. It's cultural, it's around them. But when they've made a decision to stop, they were able to stop. The person who's really struggling, as you know, with addiction, makes that commitment and then can't seem to stop. So in the DSM-5, the way the categories are listed is, again, very clunky, arguably, but it's separated out by all of the different disorders that you see on the screen before you. And so the criteria for all of the disorders is the same. It's just a different substance that's at the header of that section. So when you look at the various criteria, it's all going to be the same. It's just the difference is the substance. So what are those criteria? So for a substance use disorder, there are 11 different criteria that are listed. So this is where a clinician is meeting with a person maybe for the first time and is diagnosing whether that person has, as you can see at the bottom of my screen in red, mild, moderate, or severe substance use disorder. So that is how it is written out on a clinical sheet for insurance companies, usually, unfortunately. And so if a person has 2 to 3 of these symptoms, then that person will be categorized as having a mild substance use disorder. 4 to 5 symptoms is a moderate SUD, and 6 or more is severe. And as I said on a couple of slides ago, severe SUD is what we would term addiction. So when we're talking about moderate or mild, that is what used to be referred to as substance abuse. And what used to be substance dependence, I'm talking in the DSM-4. So the DSM 4th edition had substance abuse and substance dependence. Dependence would have been that severe category, and abuse would have been that mild and moderate category. So now again, it's put on this spectrum. And another important thing I want to mention is that dependence is different from addiction. So many of us might be dependent on a medication, for example, in order to remain healthy. So for example, I have a thyroid disorder, I take a thyroid medication, I am dependent on that medication in order to feel well. Without it, I will have a foggy brain, I'll feel extra tired, I don't feel great. So I'm dependent on that in that respect. However, if I were to stop taking my thyroid medication, it's not going to trigger me to go out and do whatever I can to get that medication as if my life depends upon it. And that's the difference when we're talking about addiction. Addiction is that behavioral aspect of what a person will do and what their brain is telling them to do as a result of feeling this just intolerable need for the drug. So again, it gets a little confusing because the DSM has changed its terminology around. And so you'll often still see in articles or when people are talking, referring to it as substance dependence. But in the world I roll in terms of language of addiction, we try to be really clear about the difference between addiction and dependence. Okay, so the Surgeon General's report, this is our friend, in my opinion, came out in 2016, a matter of, I think, days before I filed initial papers in the district court in the Eldred case. And I was very grateful that it arrived just in time. So this report describes all about what addiction is. And it's really helpful for all of us in terms of explaining addiction as a mental health disorder opposed to a criminal behavior. So this is really a breakthrough. There'd never been a report like this done by the Surgeon General before. And so I do encourage everyone, it's easy to find online. I have, the link is right there at the top of the PowerPoint slide. But it's a great resource if you are advocating for clients who are dealing with addiction in terms of characterizing it. I should perhaps at this moment back up and say that when it came to the Eldred case, I'm just going to flip back for a second. Essentially, the court did not find in our favor, and it was a somewhat complicated situation where we had in Massachusetts reported questions up to the Supreme Judicial Court. So we have a process here where if a lower court judge is not quite sure how to rule on something, they can send questions up to our Supreme Judicial Court to get a ruling from the high court on how they should address the question of law. And what happened in this case is that the Supreme Judicial Court ultimately rejected the questions that were sent up and said that the record was not sufficient to report those questions. So the foundation of our question was what I have up there on the screen, which is that, essentially if a person has a substance use disorder and relapse is a part of this disorder, and a person continues to use despite negative consequences, how can we then say that when a person uses a person who is addicted uses a substance while on probation, that is a willful violation of their probation? That our argument was that it's not willful conduct. And in Massachusetts, in order to be in violation of probation, your conduct has to have been willfully in violation. And the court, in my opinion, really dodged the issue presented because they concluded that the science that I depended on was in dispute. And so I'm very troubled by this. I don't accept this. And I hope that other courts, other places would not accept the reasoning. But essentially, the government in this case relied upon some writers, and it was really a handful, who argued that substance use disorder is not a brain disease. And I'm going to talk about the brain a little bit more in a moment, but I do want to be clear that I don't think that we should accept that, or I should say, I don't accept that the loss in this means that other people can't really push and try to win on this in other states. So I just encourage people to keep pushing the idea that using when you have an addiction is really not willful conduct in the legal sphere. Okay, so here's the thing. What I relied upon in this case was the medical consensus that is out there. And I think we all should rely on it too, because these are the major clinical medical organizations that are highly respected when it comes to all sorts of other major medical illnesses, such as heart disease and other types of brain diseases, et cetera. And yet this evidence, this science was rejected as being controversial. So the one thing I will say about the controversy is that I think there is this concept that if addiction is a brain disease, that somehow it's working like other brain diseases like Alzheimer's or a traumatic brain injury. And certainly that's not the case. A brain that's suffering from addiction can and is capable in many cases, fortunately, of being able to actually really recover. But it's the other, I should say, the kind of the people who dispute this medicalization of addiction will often say, it's a behavioral disorder, it's a social disorder. I agree with all of those things. So I just want to be clear. I agree that addiction has a behavioral aspect to it and that there is an absolute social impact to it, as there is, quite frankly, with most of our illnesses out there. Most, major illnesses are a product of a combination of factors between genetics, the environment a person is living in, poverty versus having means to get better health care, et cetera. And just because something is put in medical terms does not mean that we as a society don't have a responsibility to address all the underlying factors that also can make this illness much worse. So along that, risk factors for addiction, SUD, substance use or misuse. I highlight trauma because I especially think in the criminal legal system that we are all operating in, trauma is just so foundational to people who end up in court and end up in our prisons and jails. It is the through line for every single person I worked with at Sousa Baranowski, the maximum security prison, when I was a clinician. It is trauma, trauma, trauma. And trauma does not always manifest as addiction, but it often does. And, I think even in the news, there has been more awareness, for example, of the Catholic sex abuse scandal, and more recently with the Boy Scouts, that there have been a lot of people who were abused when they were young and then end up struggling with addiction as they get older. So trauma is just at the heart of so much of what we are dealing with as advocates. And I think a lot of times our clients are terribly misunderstood because trauma is at the heart of so many of their maladaptive behaviors, or I should say they're behaviors that were adaptive for survival needs. For example, being defensive, getting angry, learning how to fight. And addiction is learning how to numb out and not have to deal with all the pain around you. The way that a person learns to develop and cope with that experience, then in other facets, especially when getting older, become really dysfunctional. So other parts that are risk factors, it's pretty clear on the screen, but genetics, I think we all recognize is a part of it. Other mental health disorders can definitely be a risk factor. So attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, also known as ADHD. Julie Eldred, my client in the Eldred case, she had ADHD, and it was very severe when she was young. And that is, there's plenty of research that indicates a real comorbidity between SUD and ADHD. Post-traumatic stress disorder, obviously PTSD due to the trauma there. Early substance use is a problem. So while I am absolutely no fan of the DARE program, I'm a child of the 80s and I grew up with DARE, and I don't really think it's effective for the highest risk people. I do think there is something about trying to get at preventing early substance use. I would suggest that instead of using law enforcement and scare tactics of the prison and jail kind, we should be having much more of an understanding of what's going on with a young person and a child who is starting to use very young. And I think many of us, if we're interviewing clients, will learn that some clients are using substances as early as, or trying for the first time, sipping something as early as 6 or 7, but even using by 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. And that is dangerous. That is obviously not good on the brain and is a risk factor. So I think it also probably goes without saying that the environment a person's living in, and also the social risk factors, what's going on with the peer group, what's going on around a person, those are real issues. And this is another reason when I think about the prison context, my clients who are in prison and substances, drugs are all around them. We don't do a great job keeping them out of our prisons and jails, because it turns out that prohibition doesn't work in the country at large, and also doesn't work behind the wall. And, as a result, though, there's this incredible amount of boredom, lack of anything to do, and then availability. And often it's commonly what's going on around a person. And so thus drug use inside can be incredibly common. So this is just reiterating the point that I already probably said well enough, that trauma is really at the heart of so much addiction. And there's a Gabor Mate, Mate, from Canada, who writes a lot about the connection between trauma and addiction. And he's very against addiction being termed a brain disease. And I completely appreciate everything he says. And this is the thing. I agree with all of what he says about how addiction manifests. And I also understand there's a brain component to it. Again, we're all addicted to something that takes away the pain, whatever it may be for you. So shame is at the heart of addiction. And sadly, that is a lot of what our system is all about, is shaming people. And as a result of the shame, what often happens, people don't share the fact that they are struggling. So it's so important in the world of recovery for people to feel like they can actually talk about the fact that they have relapsed, because it's an integral part of getting better. But just to look at this slide, when you look at all these awful words that people feel, so many people I have worked with, they'll say to me, I was a really bad kid, or I just was really a bad person. There's this self-narrative of really being unworthy or even bad or terrible starting at a really young age. Or there are things like the trauma of sexual abuse, or not having a dad. Or one of my clients said to me yesterday when we were having a conversation, he said, I was just always so ashamed that I didn't know who my dad was. And then I learned my dad was this other person I hadn't been aware of until I was 12. And my dad wasn't the person who I'd known was my dad. And I was just so ashamed, and I just didn't want anyone to know that. So there's all of these different factors that people are dealing with. And I think if we can have compassion and understand what's underlying and driving substance use to begin with, it can help us in trying to manage the frustration that I think is also pretty obvious that can happen when working with somebody who's struggling with addiction, or having a family member or a loved one struggling with addiction, because I understand it's a balancing act. It can also be enormously frustrating when you're having someone you're trying to help and it feels like you're not making any headway. But if we can kind of come back to the underlying factors, it might help center us a little bit in empathy opposed to frustration. So here we have this image from National Geographic. I need to make sure I highlight this is from National Geographic. And this concept of hijacking the brain, the terminology also can be controversial, but essentially it's understanding that the dopamine system is getting really disrupted when somebody is addicted. So a very layperson way of putting this is that when somebody uses a drug, it will flood the brain with dopamine. And our brains are naturally developed to produce a certain amount of dopamine, which is our feel-good drug. It is the chemical in our brain that makes us feel calm, makes us feel at ease, makes us just feel, in short, makes us feel good. So when somebody is using a drug, the brain is getting this message of being flooded with this outside source of dopamine. And as a result of that, the brain starts to think, maybe I'm not supposed to be producing as sure seem to be getting it from some outside source. So as a result, the brain starts producing less dopamine. Well, this is really problematic because now that person who is already craving that dopamine hit is now producing less dopamine naturally on their own, which then drives the mind and body to want more of that outside source of the dopamine. So it becomes this really terrible cycle of the dopamine keeps getting reduced and a person keeps trying to flood it more with an outside source. So when a person is being withdrawn from that dopamine, it is no joke. As one of my friends who has struggled with addiction said, he just said, I just can't explain the feeling that overwhelms you of just like life is unbelievably dark and impossibly never going to get better. It is just, there's just no hope for any joy or feeling of pleasure or happiness ever again. And that feeling, which we'll get to in a second, of withdrawal is, of course, a major driver behind why people become so obsessed and crazed, as some people might say, that we shouldn't use that in court, but in dire need of getting that drug to just ease that pain. So, getting to what helps the dopamine system before we turn to withdrawal. Here are some things. Rebuilding the broken dopamine system. And this list, I think, is really important for also understanding why the medicalization of addiction, I think, is important for understanding the science behind it, but also that it's not necessarily medicine that always makes people better. And which, again, I would say is also true with other mental health disorders, not all of them, but there are several that non-medicinal ways of managing an illness can make people better. Same with different types of medical disorders as well. There are dietary changes, exercise changes, et cetera, that can help a person get better. So in short, positive relationships, restoring relationships, falling in love, or having a pet. This makes perfect sense because when we have these types of positive relationships, we're getting a dopamine kick. So, there's been research about love and falling in love and why being broken up with when you're in love and losing that love of your life or this very deep, intense love feels so unsettling and depressing and like a withdrawal. And there's a reason why people can term it as being a withdrawal from somebody, because there is an actual chemical reaction going on in the brain. So that's a natural way to get a dopamine hit, is to have these positive relationships in one's life. Exercise, so physical movement. There's plenty of people actually who run these ultra marathon races of 50 miles, 100 miles. Rich Roll is a very famous athlete who, as part of his recovery and transformation, got really into this ultra exercise, ultra marathon type thing. And I've talked to some people who do ultra marathons, and you'll say, oh yeah, you get a lot of people who are in recovery from addiction. So mental health treatment, which we'll get to on another slide, but that can take the form of talk therapy or other types of group therapy, or more specific targeted types of clinical treatments. Medications. So I should have put this here, but the common medications for commonly referred to as MAT, medication, Medicaid-assisted treatment. There's the reason I'm stumbling is because there's a different terminology I've been taught for what we're supposed to say, and I'm going blank on it for the moment. Oh, that's right. It's medication for addiction treatment is again, in the world of language of addiction, trying to make less stigmatizing terminology. At any rate, these would be things like methadone, Suboxone, and then also Vivitrol. These are the brand names that we're talking about here because that's what commonly people understand. Vivitrol is dosed as a shot, and it's a medication that works for some, not necessarily for others. But the important thing about Vivitrol that's different from methadone and Suboxone is that there's not an opioid in it. So methadone actually is an opioid, and Suboxone is an opioid with an opioid blocker, or it's an agonist with an antagonist. So the idea of the Suboxone is that you're raising the floor for the person with a bit of an opioid, but then there's this blocker on top to prevent the person from getting high and actually get them more at a stabilized level. So a lot of people I've worked with who have taken Suboxone as prescribed have really seen some pretty dramatic turnarounds in their life in terms of feeling like I can just function like normal. I don't feel high, but I don't feel that terrible low. I just sort of feel like the floor is raised. The difference with methadone is that methadone is a full-blown opioid, and as people probably observed, people are sometimes nodding out on methadone, and it can cause that drowsiness factor. And so, really, it's a matter of which one of these medications is best for a person. Really has to do with a patient talking to their doctors about it and figuring it out and being really communicative about what they feel like is really right for them. So constructive activities, this is important. Working, going to school, feeling like you have something to do with your day. I think all of us need this in our lives in order not to be depressed. It's one of the things about COVID-19 and being home. This lack of having a routine outside of the house can be a little maddening for people. And I think a lot of people have had to kind of come up with what is their daily routine going to be in this new world of being at home. So a sense of purpose. This is why I think a lot of people who struggle with addiction and get into recovery get really invested in AA or NA or in helping other people, because it feels really good to help other people. And probably the reason why many of us do the work that we do as public defenders in particular is because it feels good to help people. Otherwise, this job is really hard and really depressing and really difficult and maddening and all sorts of other things I could call it. But there is a certain sense of calling and purpose that I think many of us at least feel. And some of it is that, it's just interesting and exciting. But that sense of purpose is important for all people. So having a sense of accountability, self-respect, and even growing into an adult brain. So the reason the adult brain I think is important to note is because probably many people on this meeting, I'm sure there are many people who are watching this who struggle with addiction themselves. Also, probably many people who used a range of substances when they were younger. I went to a college where substance use was incredibly common around me, but I always say I went to Columbia, nice elite Ivy League college where we were cloistered off in New York City in our own bubble. And it was not the role of security on campus to try to get people a criminal record. And so when somebody was caught using a substance, they were able to have that dealt with, not through the criminal courts, whereas many of my clients who didn't have that opportunity, but were similarly using substances and experimenting and all of that, were on their doorstep and over-policed community and getting arrested for it. But many people across the spectrum will essentially grow out of that kind of experimental use. All right, so recovery is not one size fits all, which this is a slide by Dr. Ruth Pody, who's a wonderful addiction specialist here in Massachusetts. So I'm borrowing this slide from her. It's a different way of looking at a lot of the issues recovery options I listed on the previous slide, but I like this pie because it just kind of shows you all the different pieces of what helps a person get better. Now, importantly, it's not like a person needs all of these things to get better. The pie for each person is going to be different, but some configuration of these different core aspects of recovery are going to be what help people achieve sustained recovery. In terms of treatment for addiction, these are the really common forms of formalized treatment. I already went over medication for addiction treatment, but we've done that already. So individual counseling, I would really recommend when you're doing counseling for addiction, be with a licensed clinician trained specifically in addiction. The fact of the matter is that a lot of clinicians are not trained in addiction, and that is a problem. And it's something that I know National Association for Social Workers and certain doctors I know in the medical field are trying to really improve upon. But as best as possible, we want to help our clients if we're working on, a probation plan or a parole plan. We want to try to help them find somebody who's licensed and really specializes in addiction. Evidence-based therapies are CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy. MET is motivational enhancement therapy, also known as motivational interviewing. And that's a really well-known therapy in the addiction world because it's this idea of we meet a person where they're at, so to speak. So instead of coming in and imposing my ideas and my judgment about how this person should live their life, it's working with a person to come to those types of conclusions themselves. So if a person says, I can drink 6 beers a night, and I'm totally fine, then instead of going, oh, really? Can you? I'm not so sure you can. And coming in with a really judgmental attitude about it, it's working with a person saying, okay, well, let's do a journaling or let's log it. Let's figure out how this is working for you so that a person can then come in and assess for themselves, wait a second, well, maybe that's not really working for me all that great. And then we work on, okay, what do you think will help you be able to improve your outcomes here? So obviously there's professional advice from the clinician, but they're allowing the patient or client to drive the kind of thinking about where they want to take their recovery and what kind of process they want to use. DBT is dialectical behavioral therapy. EMDR is this eye movement therapy, and ACT is this concept of accepting. I think it's acceptance and commitment therapy. The idea of accepting things in your life that you really cannot change instead of feeling like you're constantly up against it. I often, when I'm working with people, use the concept of radical acceptance when something's really awful, but there's really no way to change it. Like, for example, clients I have who are in prison on a life sentence where they're seeking parole, they have to have some radical acceptance of this is the terms of which I'm in, and these are the things I need to do in order to get out. Because if they're constantly in a state of, I shouldn't have to be here, this isn't fair, et cetera, and if that's not getting that person anywhere, it's not useful to furthering their life. Now, sometimes, you need that feeling of this isn't fair, and it's not just, because that actually drives you to get some sort of litigation going or whatever you need to get out, but it all depends on the circumstances. So obviously case management is really important. If somebody's homeless, the first thing you need to do is get somebody a place to live before you can start talking about getting them addiction treatment. You can't work on the addiction until you have dealt with some of these underlying issues like poverty and just getting a person stabilized. So mutual peer support, that would be what we commonly know as 12-step recovery, such as AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, or Narcotics Anonymous, recovery coaches, and then there's Smart Recovery, which tend to be not have the God element that AA and NA have. And then family therapy. These are different forms of family therapy that can be also helpful for people. So I just discussed all of the aspects of recovery that are really helpful for our clients, which I think, one of the reasons it's good for us to know that as advocates is because these are concepts we want to be arguing in court and to prosecutors for why they should not end up here in a jail or prison cell. Because everything you see in this picture that our clients are subjected to is the absolute opposite of the pie chart that I showed you. Jail and prison is all about deprivation. It's about cutting off relationships. It is about making sure that you are deprived of anything in life that can possibly give you any bit of joy. And even just the basics of the lack of nature is a huge problem. So when you look here and there's that little bit of sunlight, and who knows what that's even looking out on. But I know that my clients who have been in prison, many of them between 15 and even 45 years, many of them have said, I have not seen a tree since I came to prison at 16 or 17 years old. That is a huge deficit to the brain. Our brain is meant, the human animal is meant to be in nature. We are meant to have trees and grass and a sky and be able to see the beauty around us. So there are plenty of therapies out there that didn't even put up on the screen, but I think some of the best, which is going for a walk and being for a walk in nature in particular. And I just heard an interview with Sanjay Gupta talking about how he said the best thing you could do for a brain, if you had to pick the number one thing, is going for a brisk walk with a friend and talking about your problems. And so prison and jail is the absolute opposite of all of that. This is just what minimum security would look like. So often we either have somebody who's completely isolated, like in that other picture I showed, or overcrowded in a cell with multiple people. This is the minimum security. My back hurts just looking at these mattresses. This is MCA Cedar Junction, Walpole, which used to be the notorious maximum security prison here in Massachusetts, but just another visual on the type of deprivation we are subjecting people to. This is Susan Baranowski. This is where I worked. This is what almost every single unit except for the solitary confinement, so-called segregation or restrictive housing units look like. Again, not a bit of nature, all cement, linoleum, etc. This is a recreation cage. So again, all of these visuals are just to show what I think we all know, but sometimes we don't really see as much if we haven't worked in a prison and we don't get to really see what's happening to our clients. This is when somebody is held in solitary confinement. Again, up here, we now call it restrictive housing. If their outdoor time for that 1 hour a day, what they get when they're locked in a cell 23 hours a day, they get 1 hour a day, often weather permitting, often weekdays, but they're supposed to get 1 hour a day on these so-called recreation decks. So it's just a cage outside. This is at Susan Baranowski. At Walpole, they have cages that truly look like a dog kennel all lined up on the ground outside. This is the horrifying group therapy treatment that people will get when they're in higher security. This is San Quentin, but we have very similar so-called therapeutic modules, is what they call them. I call them cages. And we have these at Susan Baranowski and also at Walpole as well. This is where people who are considered to be higher security risk but need mental health will go into cages like this for group therapy. The clinician will sit there out in front of them. On the better end of things, this would be the residential drug abuse. As we know, we don't use that word, but program in a federal bureau of prison. I think this is lower security, but this would obviously, I don't want to paint a completely false picture that everything looks like this. However, I do want us to be aware of that, and that this is, maybe what you're getting on the other end, if you're able to get in a program that actually has good leadership and has good clinicians, which is a really key thing. The prisons here in Massachusetts, the mental health clinicians do not provide the therapy for addiction. It's actually deemed a totally different program through a vendor called Spectrum. And it's not a requirement, actually, that the Spectrum counselors have any kind of license whatsoever. So by just the reports of my clients, it appears that most of the so-called clinicians in the who are running the similar programs like the one on this screen actually don't have any sort of trained clinical background at all. Okay, so I realize I'm really running late here, and I should have gotten a bit more to drug overdose homicide cases, but you're going to get the rest of this presentation of this training will have a lot to do about this. But really quickly, let's just look at the surge over time. I encourage everybody to go to the Health and Justice Action Lab website through the Northeastern University School of Law. They have done a ton of amazing research, and Leo Beletsky was very kind to let me borrow a few slides from him. But again, I encourage everybody to go to their website. This is a chart of how we have seen a rise in these types of prosecutions over the years. Again, this is a slide of the states that are being more active. Excuse me. Very hard to see. I can see from this slide, but we have Pennsylvania is the worst. And then going down the line, a whole bunch of other states. Okay, enforcement. We have the problem of the myth of the dealer. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice at the end of this training. Let's see if I can get it back here. So the idea, here is that I think many of us know who are dealing with these cases that it is not a so-called dealer who's actually getting prosecuted. It is what we would term the lowest hanging fruit. It is a family, it's a friend, it's somebody else who is a person who is addicted and using. So why are these drug overdose homicide cases a real policy problem? Well, for multiple reasons, and this is just a generalized synopsis, but as I said a moment ago, it really ensnares the lowest hanging fruit. So we're talking often that it's, addicted friends, it's people who somebody uses with, it's the type of situation where on a different day, the person who is getting prosecuted could be the person who overdosed and died. And then family members are often getting caught up in these prosecutions. Really importantly and terribly, it's undermining the 911 Good Samaritan laws, which we have in all 50 states. My understanding is that the federal government still does not have a so-called Good Samaritan law, but these laws are designed to incentivize help seeking. So if somebody is with somebody who is overdosing or appears to be overdosing, we want people to call 911. However, if there is a fear that you are going to be prosecuted for one of these, for a drug overdose homicide, there's a real incentive not to call 911 because you don't want to be there and be implicated as being a part of this. So it's really interfering with the Good Samaritan laws. And as a result, it's interfering with the timely administration of naloxone if the people who are using don't have it on them and you need 911 in order to get it, and you're not getting 911 called, you're not getting the life-saving drug naloxone. And then it's also at our odds with just general harm reduction efforts to reduce the isolation that we have among people who use. So sometimes we have people who are using together, but not all the time. And the fact is, it'd be better if we always had people using together instead of by themselves. Because if people start thinking, I don't want to risk my friend or loved one or anyone getting charged with this kind of a crime, there's an incentive for somebody to use by themselves. And then finally, I think as we all know, the war on drugs has done nothing to actually deter drug sales or drug use. And similarly, these prosecutions have done nothing to change that as well. So these are the huge policy problems that we're all fighting up against. I have an amicus brief called Carrillo that is in the handout materials on the website. And I believe you have an amicus brief by my co-authors on that, Jeremiah Golka and Leo Beletsky, who I worked on that brief with. They did a federal version of that brief, which goes into all of this in real detail. And I think their federal brief is really excellent too. So in short, if the defendant, got 5 minutes left. So in short, if the defendant suffers from addiction and provides drugs to a fellow user who then overdoses and dies, I think we should all be arguing the defendant's purchase of opioids for a fellow addicted person is not reckless in view of the science of addiction. So that is what our Carrillo case was really all about. And again, I welcome people to read what we wrote in the amicus brief. Ultimately, the Supreme Judicial Court in Massachusetts agreed that there shouldn't have been a prosecution or shouldn't have been a conviction for involuntary manslaughter, but they did not agree that the sharing of the drugs was not distribution, which is a different problem. So in general, a person struggling with drug addiction typically ingests multiple times a day in a desperate effort to feel normal and stave off withdrawal. So that's that part where we talked about the brain. It's how a person's feeling both mentally and physically. So using an opioid when addicted is really required to feel stable and normal. And just as a side note, when it comes to alcohol, for example, it's really dangerous to just be in cold withdrawal from alcohol. And so it is always good to have someone be able to get help, but if they can't, it's understandable why someone ends up using an illicit opioid, because there's this massive desperation. So again, this is from the amicus brief that the basics of our argument that severe substance use disorders are chronic illness in which changes in brain circuitry and physical tolerance to the drug drive a person to daily compulsive use as if their life depends upon it. And so in that case, where the defendant and the decedent both suffered from opioid addiction, and it was a case where the defendant had purchased the drugs for both of them to use, that, we argued that the defendant's purchase of the opioid from his known supplier for the decedent was not wanton or reckless, but rather an act to manage the illness. Now, importantly, I just want to note that we use the word decedent very carefully. We did not use the word victim. That was a very careful choice, and I would encourage others to do the same. Again, on another day, it could have been the defendant who had been the one who had perhaps overdosed. The other thing about that case, and I think isn't talked about enough, is that it's often not heroin by itself. It's basically never heroin by itself that is killing people. It is heroin that is laced with something else, or it's heroin that people are using in combination with another drug. For example, benzodiazepines is a very dangerous combination. And so obviously studying those toxicology reports is really important. But it's just highlighting that if we actually had safe, legal heroin that was clean, that somebody could get in a safe, medicalized environment and be able to inject in a safe environment, people would not die from heroin. It's the buying of it on the street because of the war on drugs and because of the prohibition. People do not know what they are buying, and therefore they're injecting themselves with they don't know what. So in short, if it worked to punish people for addiction and relapse, we would have a cured nation. We certainly do not. And I'll just end by saying I always encourage all of us to tap into our empathy as much as possible. Like I said, even I know in the face of what can be sometimes very difficult work and very difficult folks to work with.